Hi, today I have with me Wendy Bradley, who is a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at SMU Cox School of Business. And we're going to talk about your paper, Avengers Assemble When Digital Piracy Increases Box Office Demand. Thanks for taking the time and um, enjoyed reading your paper too.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this paper.
Yeah, definitely. So you've been working on this research for a long time, from what I understand. Can you just tell me a little bit about that journey of getting here?
Absolutely. So, as a lot of things did, this sort of came out of COVID during the pandemic when a lot of things changed. And we
Mm,
had this idea, and we're working on this paper pre COVID, but I think its message became more important and much clearer to us once COVID hit. And that was this idea that people may want to consume creative content, so movies, books, music, in a different way due to digitization. And so when this movie is ultimately about movie piracy and then box office, so in theater sales. But when COVID hit, I think the message was clear that when movie theaters were shut down, it was evident that the type of content, how it was consumed, where it was consumed, actually mattered a lot, those
mm.
complementarities. And so, yeah, this paper's been going on a long time, but we're glad to see where it's progressed.
Right. So one thing in the paper I noticed that many many past papers have inferred piracy, but this paper observes its effects. Can you talk a little bit about that, and also just that your work confirms that piracy can boost box office receipts as well in a case?
Yeah, so the question that we ask in this paper is relatively simple. So, does digital piracy, and again, for creative goods, so movies, books, music, does it impact the legal demand for those goods? And you would think that this would be a relatively basic idea. If you get something for free, you pirate it illegally, then why would you also purchase something,
Mhm.
purchase that same thing? But it turns out that there's a lot of research on this question, and it's still open ended. We still don't quite know why we don't universally, as researchers, find a negative effect of piracy on
Mm,
sales.
yeah,
So, our context is movies, and we can get into that. But while there's a lot of research on piracy, I think it's still an unanswered question.
right. Yeah, so you in your paper, yeah, you do focus on, you look at movies, two types of movies, and just something to highlight is just that The Expendables 3 was pirated almost 190,000 times when a pre-release copy was released. And also your data, you look at all movies released and when a pirated copy occurred all the way back to 2000. Can you talk a little bit about, your experiment and these two types of movies that kind of stood out in your experiment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a quote in there from a movie critic who admitted that he was one of the people that pirated that movie, The Expendables, which was, I think, at the time, one of the most pirated films of all time. So it
Mhm.
got a lot of attention. But in his critic review, he said, "Yes, I got this movie for free, but I'm absolutely going into movie theaters to watch it again." And he said, because there's nothing like being around other people and, pumping your fist in the air with the audience, and there's nothing like the experience, and it's that to us was this anecdotal sort of evidence that we were on the right track of investigating this concept, which we call spectacleness.
Mhm.
So um, you can think about it in terms of, again, we can use concrete movies, but
Yeah.
spectacleness we use to measure this desirability you may have based on a combination of tangible and also intangible properties to view a movie in theaters. So you can think about X-Men or Iron Man and Marvel movies. You want to see it with other people and
Right.
gasp at the same time,
Right.
listen to the surround sound, etc. Things it's just not possible at home.
Right.
So that will be what we call like a highly spectacle movie.
Right.
And now you can think about the opposite end of the spectrum for movies like 27 Dresses or The Vow. Uh, these are movies based predominantly on the storytelling and screenwriting and not so much on, those other components
Mhm.
of,
Yeah,
again, large screen, needing to go get the surround sound and things like that. So if you watch those types of movies at home, what we call more story oriented films, if you watch it on your couch or in bed, you're not really missing out on that feeling
right,
in theaters. And so we think this is the key component that
right.
might explain why we see sometimes movie piracy complements and increases box office sales, and then sometimes movie piracy substitutes or reduces box office sales. And so that's what we focus on, spectacleness.
Right. Yeah, and I noticed in your paper that you found that piracy, in fact, boosts revenue 24% for spectacle type films. And whereas the story form, it was a reduction. I can't remember the number, but
Yeah, 26%.
26. Yeah, so so that's really interesting. But you also found that movies with spectacle elements and studios can leverage the optimal product mix regarding their distribution and movie types. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and that's to us, thank you, really important because obviously we're not condoning illegal behavior or piracy, but you can at least learn something. And so that's why we think this research is important. And one of the things that a movie studio could learn and then change about our study is this idea that if spectacle films do, even when they're pirated for free, which obviously you don't want, an infringement of your intellectual property,
Right.
but if they still induce people to go to theaters, you could probably relax your enforcement efforts. Probably
Mhm.
don't have to go target piracy as much.
Right.
Whereas if you're releasing a more story oriented film, then that might be the place where you really need to protect your IP, limit who gets screeners, what you call like movie screeners, who gets like a preview, limit the distribution of that digital version as much as you can. And
Mhm.
that would be a way to sort of combat piracy. So that's one way you could do it. An alternative thing is you could, as a movie theater, given these results, change which types of films you produce for theaters and which types of films you produce for direct to streaming.
Right.
Which is something we're already seeing, I think. So those rom-coms that everyone wants to see at home, send them direct to streaming. And
Right.
for those highly spectacle Marvel type films, X-Men, Expendables, then maybe you release them direct to theaters, which is the normal process
Mhm.
and the
Yeah, that's
production.
really interesting, and I wonder if that means that more movies are even being made now, and with this differentiation, I mean, it's not something I follow, but I just wonder because with streaming, you can put so much more content out, right? I mean, it's just endless.
For sure. And I think so creative industries are really unique. And I think that's what, again, I find interesting about this is often the creator, when they're producing creative work, so, a painter or a musician, or in this case, like a storyteller, screenwriter,
Yeah.
they're not necessarily envisioning the strategy for release later. I mean, today maybe they are a little bit more, but often the creator of a work is doing it because of that creative outlet,
Right.
for a different type of consumption.
Right.
And so I think our paper sheds light on, given what you know of the content, that creative content,
Mm-hmm.
now you can make a more informed and profitable decision for how it's released.
Right, right. Yeah, it's just getting more of a scalpeled approach and that it still takes this, movie studios kind of like an editor, picking stories and things like that. So you have these roles that are becoming more distinct and obvious in some respects. Um, so also I noticed that you mentioned that there's implications, for sports, concert tours, education, finding the balance between online and live performance of things. Can you just, is there anything that stood out in your mind regarding that?
Yeah, I think this is where the COVID pandemic made this story come full circle for us, because that was about the time that Hamilton was really popular in musical theater. And
Right,
obviously, that's an in-person production.
right.
And during COVID, they released it on Disney Plus, I believe. And a lot of people didn't know if that was going to be successful. If you go back and you read what people wrote about it, they thought, why would you do that? It won't be the same. We want to see it in theaters. But um, it actually, I think, did really well.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can think about other things during the pandemic that were forced to be shown digitally, things that were maybe less successful, like classroom education.
Mm,
That it wasn't received as well. And so you just started to see a difference in the type of content and
yeah,
how consumers preferred to consume that content. And so that's where, again, the COVID pandemic really, I think, highlighted for us that we were onto something interesting and unique, that maybe the type of content changes the importance of those externalities, of those complementarities.
right, right. I saw Hamilton live when it first came out in like 2017 in New York or something. And then yeah, and so there's these release strategies and repackaging strategies and all that you've seen, as a result of the pandemic. It's like, oh, let's try it in this format. Oh, let's try it, some
Yeah, and
successful, some not.
the thing is, when we say spectacle, I would encourage anyone who's watching this to read more about it in the paper. But in how we measure it, it's not simply. I mean, I'm doing it a disservice to reference just those action films, because it's not
Yeah.
that. It turns out that's actually not the only element for spectacleness. So
Mhm.
on our list of the most spectacle movies, we have movies like Tangled,
Mhm.
um, which is obviously singing, and you might assume initially maybe that was story based. It's not. Um, there's also some, so like Oblivion or Inside Out. There's some, I would say, slow moving horror films, and I
Mhm.
think again this idea of spectacle isn't just about, yeah, well, I mean, we're not just measuring action films or a genre.
Right.
It's actually very nuanced
Right.
in how it's made, and whether or not you want to see it with family or friends outside the home. What's the content? How
Mhm.
does it look? So it's kind of a nuanced measure. And
Yeah.
so if you apply it to, let's say, sports events or musical theater, again, it might be something worth pursuing in these other industries to figure out what combination of elements make those more or less successful on different formats.
Right. Right. So one of the takeaways I saw was just that the value of an information good, like a movie in this case, depends on its content and how it's consumed, its context. And obviously, this applies, to the online and offline world, digital world, especially. Do you see areas where this informs creative goods? And I know that we've talked a lot about, some of the startups and entrepreneurial ventures. Do you have any color or thoughts about that big finding of yours?
Yeah, I think, again, it's always nice when sort of you get a gut check for complicated research. And so one of them is, if you think about the term Netflix and chill,
Mhm.
Um, I generally think of, again, these like rom-coms that you want to see at home, and you want to sit next to someone on the couch and it's more intimate. And so it makes sense to me that those would be the type of movies released in theaters, that they'd be produced and released on Netflix. But now, so going outside of it to answer your question, you see Netflix doing these, what they're calling Netflix houses. We're
Mhm.
talking in Dallas, and there's one opening in Dallas and Chicago. And so they're testing the market to see what people like, but it's essentially an experiential version of their film portfolio and
Right.
TV portfolio. And I think that's very interesting that now in the motion picture industry and movies and streaming, they're realizing this demand for experiences, the spectacleness that we're describing in this
Yeah.
paper. And then it's even outside of movies. I think we see it more definitely after music piracy. We got streaming music, but then a huge growth in live music.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think digitization, it has a lot of important impacts. And one of them is reminding consumers that you like to consume digital products, but you also miss in-person experiences.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we're at. Again, COVID
Yeah.
also influenced that, but I
Right.
think it's also digitization influenced that. We were
To-
getting a lot of digital content and we decided we also miss interaction.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We're saturated with the online world and we have to get outside of that experience into a real experience. No, definitely. Yeah, I see a real uptick in events, and just all sorts of, in-person offerings like never before.
Yeah, and just one more aspect of that is Netflix, for example, started streaming a bunch of comedy shows. And I know, again, this is just anecdotal for me, but I think this also is sort of a future application of our research. This idea that I've heard from a lot of people, not just me, that you get a little bit of a preview of
Mhm.
new comics, of comedy, and you think, oh, this is great. And I know I've since purchased so many more comedy in-person show tickets than I
Right.
ever had before
Right.
because of that quick teaser
Yeah.
digitally of, oh, okay, this is fun, this is cool, I want to
Yeah.
go do this.
Yeah.
So
Oh, definitely. No, I know that's happened to me with indie concerts. So,
yeah, exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, no, definitely. So again, another takeaway, you show how and where people like to consume digital economy outputs, and this gets at capturing the value of information goods in creative industries. Was there any other kind of highlight thoughts, remarks that you had about the research that we missed?
Um, yeah, I mean it's a good time in wrapping up just to do a general summary. I think that's helpful. So we are looking at digital piracy. So on the one hand, you think if I get something for free, I don't need to purchase it legally. But then on the other hand, as we've been talking about, piracy could be some sort of informal advertising or have a promotional effect where you consume it illegally and then you think, oh, I wouldn't have bought it, but now I will. And so
Mhm.
that could increase sales. So you have this conflicting effect, a ton of research on this. And I think we add to a lot of prior literature in measuring it directly and then teasing apart a more nuanced and marginal effect, which is depending on the content of that digital good, of that information good. And in our case, movies, depending on its spectacleness, that changes the impact on consumers to go out to movie theaters or to illegally consume it and forego. And I think that that's an important thing for studios to learn from.
Mhm.
And then I think, as we just talked about, I think we see that same effect in a lot of other creative industries. So whether it's musical theater, getting a little bit of digital good exposure might make me go out and see and purchase a ticket for the real thing. You can also think about it in education. So digital lessons are often not that effective.
Mhm.
Um, and so maybe it's about, well, what is the content? So maybe chemistry needs to
Mhm.
be partially online, partially in person. Maybe, economics can be totally online because the content is easily described on a screen. Maybe business, again, is something hybrid, something both. But I think it's time, since we have this influx of content, to look at the actual content of digital goods in creative industries to decide how best to deliver them to maximize, if you're a firm, that value. And I think it goes beyond movies. That's
Yeah,
my opinion. So
yeah, absolutely. And just out of curiosity, what you just relayed to me, have you seen much research that kind of gets at what you're discussing in this nuance, look at content, digital, and what's applicable? Um,
well, so I haven't. There's a lot of really good papers having to do with, as I said, digital piracy. So I definitely don't want to say that,
but yeah.
yeah, we're the only one. But I will say that I recently listened to an interview by Matthew Ball, who was the ex CEO, I think, of Amazon Studios. And
Mhm.
he was talking about the metaverse, but he had a quick quote where he said, oh, those spectacle films, the ones that do well in theaters. And I just thought that was such a validation of this
Yeah,
research when
yeah.
he said that, because it was, a recent interview from just even maybe a month ago. So it's really nice when you produce research, I think, that is sort of provides the first evidence of a
Yeah.
concept that maybe we all observed and thought was obvious. And so that's what I think this does. I haven't seen other research in this vein, but I'm hoping obviously we are the first to shed light on it.
Yeah, start a new vein.
Yeah,
A
exactly.
new stream. Yeah, because it is all new. And I know we've discussed this in some of the work we've discussed on big tech and the metaverse and, you know, how to slice and dice that and where things are going. So yeah, this paper really gets in the weeds about this within an industry. So that's really cool. So um
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, we think so. Again, yeah, just for your comment, there's a lot of work discussing digital goods as if they're all the same.
right.
And it's true they possess similar properties, but I think it's cool in this paper that we talk about what the digital good is, what information it's holding in that information good matters a lot.
Right. Yeah, because there's a lot of product variation now with digital goods, right? That before is like just a big, a big universe of it, the metaverse, right? Now it's, now it's like little planets, But
No, exactly. It's been estimated, I think, that information stored digitally surpasses any physical storage, which is wild. So
wow. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thanks for your time. And I know we'll keep talking about all this. It's just the beginnings in some respects. So
absolutely. Thank you so much for talking about this paper with me.